There is a tower in the Cascade foothills, 62 feet above the forest floor, where a man has been watching for fire for 4 years. And the summer I climbed up to photograph him was the summer I stopped being able to leave. My name is Oleander Fitch. Most people call me Olin. I'm 31. I shoot documentary work for a Portland-based conservation nonprofit, and I have spent the better part of 3 years pointing my camera at things that are disappearing. Old-growth corridors, salmon runs, the particular quality of light that exists in a forest that hasn't burned yet. I came to the Cascade Lookout Tower on a Tuesday in August with a press pass, a medium format camera, and the working assumption that I'd get 2 hours of material, file the story by Friday, and be back in my apartment on Division Street by the weekend. I was wrong about the timeline by approximately 4 months. The man in the tower was named Vesper Crane. He was 36, lean in the way of people who move carefully in small spaces, with hands that were permanently resin-stained from the railing he'd been gripping for 4 summers, and eyes that had spent so much time scanning distance that they seemed almost reluctant to focus on anything close. He had a radio, a pair of Osborne Firefinder binoculars, a logbook with entries going back to his first season, and a shelf of paperback novels with their spines so cracked they'd given up pretending to be objects and become pure text. He met me at the base of the stairs with the particular expression of a man who has agreed to something he's not sure about. "You're the photographer," he said. Not unfriendly. "Careful, Olin Fitch." I held out my hand. "I'll stay out of your way." He shook it. His grip was dry and deliberate. "You won't be able to," he said. "It's a 14 by 14 cab up there. But I appreciate the intention." He wasn't wrong about the cab. Here's what nobody tells you about a fire lookout tower, and this is where everything starts. 14 feet by 14 feet is not a small space if you're alone in it. It becomes a small space the moment there are 2 of you, and it becomes something else entirely. Something I don't have a precise word for. When one of those 2 people is Vesper Crane at 7 in the morning, with the Cascades going pink through every window, and a cup of coffee in his hand, and 4 years of accumulated stillness in his body, like a weather system that has found its preferred form. He moved around me without touching me. This sounds simple. It was not simple. The cab required negotiation. Whose elbow went where? Who stepped back when the other needed the north window? How 2 bodies occupy a 14-foot space without either of them pretending the other isn't there. We worked this out in the first hour without discussing it, the way you work out the grammar of a shared space, and by noon I understood that Vesper Crane was one of the most spatially aware people I had ever been near. I photographed him from the south window with the Cascades behind him. I photographed his hands on the Osborne binoculars, the particular angle of his head when he was scanning Sector 4. I photographed the logbook open to that morning's entry, his handwriting small and consistent, the way it looked like a man who had decided early on that if he was going to write something down, it was going to be accurate. He let me photograph him the way he let me occupy the cab, by not making it a production. He went about his work. I went about mine. By 2 in the afternoon, we had been in a 14-foot room together for 7 hours, and I had not wanted to leave for any of them. At 3, he said, "You staying for the evening scan?" "If that's all right," I said. "It's your press pass," he said. He looked out the north window. "The light's different at evening, if you're shooting for atmosphere." "I'm always shooting for atmosphere," I said. He looked at me then. First time he'd looked at me directly all day, not the peripheral awareness of shared space, but actual eye contact, sustained, a little searching. "Why fire lookouts?" He said. "Because nobody looks at them," I said. "Everyone talks about wildfires. Nobody talks about the people who watch for them." He was quiet for a moment. "Most people who come up here want the drama," he said. "The smoke, the radio calls. They want to watch me call in a strike." "I want to watch you not call one in," I said. "I want to photograph the watching." Something shifted in his face. Not a smile. Something that happened underneath where a smile would go, like a foundation settling. "Okay," he said. "Stay for the evening scan." I stayed for the evening scan. I stayed for 3 days. Wait, don't move past this part, because this is when I understood what I was really photographing. On the second morning, I woke in my tent at the tower base and climbed the stairs at 5:45 to find Vesper already at the north window with his logbook open and his coffee made, and the forest below still in that pre-dawn blue that exists for maybe 20 minutes and belongs entirely to itself. He heard me on the stairs. He didn't turn around. "Coffee's on the burner," he said. I poured a cup. I stood at the east window. The Cascades were silhouettes against the sky that was making up its mind about color. Below the tower, the Douglas firs ran in every direction as far as the low light allowed. Dark, enormous, permanent in the way that things that have been there for 300 years feel permanent. Which is to say genuinely, not just comparatively. We stood at separate windows for 20 minutes without speaking. I have been in rooms with a lot of people. I have photographed subjects in silence. It's part of the work, the practiced quiet that lets people forget the camera is there. But the silence in that cab at 5:45 in the morning with the Cascades coming up out of the dark was different from professional silence. It was the silence of two people who didn't need to perform being comfortable because they simply were. At 6:05, Vesper said, without turning from the window, "You're not shooting." I looked down at the camera in my hands. I hadn't raised it. "No," I said. "Why not?" I thought about it honestly. "Because I didn't want to interrupt it," I said. He turned then, looked at me across the 14 feet. "The light or the quiet?" he said. "Both," I said. He nodded, very slowly, like someone confirming something they'd suspected. He turned back to the north window. The sky above the Cascades went from blue to the particular pale gold of an Oregon August morning, and I raised my camera and shot 18 frames, and every one of them had Vesper in the periphery, and every one of them was, I knew even then, about something other than fire. Here's what I didn't expect, and this is the part that changed the shape of everything. On the second evening, he cooked. This sounds ordinary. It was not ordinary. He had a 2-burner camp stove and a cast iron pan and a small cooler, resupplied weekly by the Forest Service truck, and he made a meal in the cab. Rice and vegetables and something with dried chilies that smelled like wood smoke and warmth, with the same unhurried precision he brought to the log entries and the sector scans. He moved in the small kitchen corner of the cab without wasted motion and without commentary, and when it was done he set a plate in front of me on the small folding table and sat across from me in the evening light, and we ate with the Cascades going orange outside every window. I said, "How did you end up here?" He thought about it. Not the social version of thinking about it, the real version, the kind that takes a moment because the real answer is underneath a few easier ones, and you have to move past those first. "I needed something that was only one thing," he said. "I was in Portland. I was doing a lot of things. I was busy in the way that's actually a kind of hiding." He looked at his plate. "Up here it's one thing. Watch for fire. Log what you see. Don't miss anything." "Do you miss Portland?" "Sometimes. Certain parts." He looked out the west window. The sun was most of the way down. "I miss being near people, and I don't miss the noise they make. That's a difficult combination." "I know that combination," I said. He looked at me. "Yeah. I've been doing this work for 3 years," I said. "I go to places that are almost empty and I photograph them, and I come home to the city, and something is always—" I stopped. "Off," I said. "Something is always slightly off." "Like the tuning," he said. "Exactly like the tuning." He was quiet for a moment. The Cascades in the west window went from orange to deep red, to the kind of purple that means the day is genuinely over and not just slowing down. "What do you do with that?" he said. "When you're home and it's off." "I look at the pictures," I said. "The ones from the field. I try to remember what it felt like to be in the places." "Does it work?" "Not really," I said. He nodded. Like this was the right answer, and he'd known it would be. "It doesn't work for me either," he said. "The coming back." We sat with that for a while. The cab went dark by degrees, and Vesper lit a small lantern on the table, and the light it made was warm and close and turned everything inside the cab into something that felt like a painting of the moment rather than the moment itself. Which is a thing that happens sometimes in certain lights, in certain places, and which I had learned over 3 years to recognize as a signal that something real was happening. I raised my camera. He looked at the lens. Not away from it. At it. Directly, like a question. I lowered it. "Sorry," I said. "Don't be," he said. "I just wondered what you were seeing." "You," I said, "in the lantern light." He looked at the lantern, then back at me. "That's the first time you've said the subject out loud," he said. "I know," I said. The lantern burned between us. Outside the cab, the forest went fully dark, and the stars above the Cascades came out one at a time, the way they do at elevation when there's no moon. Not all at once, but incrementally, each one a separate decision. Don't skip this next part, because this is where the distance closed. On the third morning I was supposed to leave, I had my bag packed at the base of the tower. I had my car on the access road. I had a Friday deadline, and an editor in Portland who communicated exclusively in terse emails and had already sent 2 of them. I had every reason to go, and I stood at the base of the stairs and looked up at the 62 feet of tower above me and could not make myself start the drive. I climbed the stairs instead. Vesper was at the south window. He looked at me when I came through the hatch. He looked at my bag still on my back. "You're leaving," he said. "I was," I said. He was quiet. "I have a deadline," I said. "I know," he said. "I'll file it from here if you have signal." "I have signal," he said. "1 bar, but it's enough." I took my bag off. I set it against the east wall. I sat down on the floor below the north window with my back against the wall and my camera in my lap and looked at him. He looked back at me for a long moment. Then he turned back to the south window and picked up the binoculars and said, quietly, "Sector 3's been hazy since yesterday. I want to watch it this morning." "I'll be here," I said. He scanned Sector 3. I sat on the floor and did not photograph him and did not leave, and the morning came through every window of the cab in that long, slow Oregon August way, like something being poured. At 10:15, he said, without turning from the window, "There's a trail behind the tower. 2 miles out to a ridge. You can see 4 mountain peaks on a clear day." "Is today clear?" "Mostly." "Show me," I said. He put down the binoculars. He looked at me over his shoulder. The light through the south window was behind him, and his face was in soft shadow, and the expression on it was something I recognized from the lantern light photograph I hadn't taken. Open, careful, decided. "Yeah," he said. "Okay. Here's the part that I've told exactly 2 people before you." The trail behind the tower went through old-growth Douglas fir for the first mile, the trees so tall and close that the light came through in shafts, specific and angled, the way cathedral light works, and the sound underfoot was the soft compression of decades of duff. Vesper walked slightly ahead. Not leading, just the comfortable habit of someone who knows the ground. Every so often he'd hold a branch back without looking, knowing I was behind him, and the gesture was so natural and unconsidered that it lodged somewhere in my chest and stayed. At the ridge the trees opened. 4 mountains, Hood, Adams, St. Helens, Rainier, arranged across the northern sky like an argument for the existence of scale. Below the ridge the forest ran in every direction, green and enormous, bisected by the silver thread of a creek catching the late morning light. I raised my camera. Shot 12 frames. Put it down. Vesper was standing at the edge of the ridge with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking north. He had the same expression he wore at the lookout windows, total patient attention, except pointed at something he wasn't required to watch. Something he'd chosen. "You come here often," I said, "because sometimes the stupid thing is also the true thing." He smiled, sideways, small, the rarest expression he had, which made it the most valuable. "When I need to remember why," he said. "Why what?" "Why I stay up there." He looked at the mountains. "Some days the cab is 14 feet by 14 feet, and it's been 3 weeks since I've had a real conversation, and the radio is quiet, and I write in the logbook and eat and sleep and get up and do it again and—" He stopped. "Some days I need to see what I'm watching for." I stood beside him at the ridge edge. Close. Not touching, but close enough that the sleeve of my jacket was 2 inches from his. The wind off the mountains was mild and smelled like snow that was far away. and the forest below was the particular deep green that Oregon forests are in August, saturated, excessive, unapologetic. "I've been trying to photograph disappearing things for 3 years," I said. "I come home and the pictures are good and the work is real and something is still—" I looked at the mountains. "I keep thinking I'm missing the frame, like the thing I'm supposed to be shooting is just outside what the lens can reach." He turned and looked at me, not the peripheral awareness, not the logbook precision. Full attention, close, with the mountains behind him and the ridgelight on his face. "What does it look like?" he said. "The thing outside the frame." I looked at him. "This," I said. "Honestly, it looks like this." The wind moved through the firs below. A hawk turned a long, slow circle over the creek. Vesper looked at me for what felt like a complete unit of time. Not long, not short, just whole. And then he reached out and took the camera from my hands, slowly, asking with a gesture before the words, and I let him take it. He looked at it. Then he looked at me. "Can I?" he said. "Yeah," I said. He raised the camera. He looked at me through the viewfinder. He was quiet for a moment, adjusting something. Not the settings, something about where he was standing, the angle, what was in the frame. Then he said, "You're always on the other side of this thing." "I know," I said. "What's it like, being looked at?" "I don't know," I said. "I've been behind it so long." "Look at the mountains," he said. "Don't perform it." I looked at the mountains. I heard the shutter, once, twice, 5 times, then quiet. I turned back, and he was lowering the camera and looking at the image on the screen, and his face was doing something private, something I wasn't meant to see, and I didn't look away. "You look like someone who came home," he said, quietly, almost to himself. I stepped toward him. He looked up from the camera. The distance between us was nothing, a foot less, and his face at this proximity was the face I'd been photographing for 3 days, except close, real, without glass between us. And his eyes had that quality I'd first noticed in the cab, the one that took me a day to name. The quality of someone who has spent 4 years learning to see things at a distance, and is now, for the first time in a while, looking at something close. I put my hand on his jaw. Just my hand. Just there. He went very still, not the animal stillness of a startled thing, the opposite, the stillness of something that has arrived. "You okay?" I said. His exhale was long and slow and warm, and when it was done he turned his face slightly into my hand, 1 degree, maybe 2, barely perceptible, and said, "I keep being." "Me too," I said. And then I closed the last of the distance, and his mouth was warm, and the mountains were behind us, and he still had my camera in his hands and his other. Hand came up and held the back of my neck with the same care he gave everything. Precise, unhurried, like something he'd been going to do for longer than he'd admitted, and the ridge held us in. The August light and the hawk made another circle over the creek, and the forest below went on being enormous and old and indifferent and beautiful. When we stopped, he pressed his forehead to mine. Both of us breathing. His thumb moved once along the back of my neck. "The frame," he said very quietly. "Yeah," I said. "You found it." "We found it," I said. He pulled back just enough to look at me. The ridge light was direct and honest, and had nowhere to hide, and neither did we, and it was the best I'd felt in 3 years of pointing a camera at things that were disappearing. What the Forest Service trail camera mounted at the Cascade Ridge trailhead recorded on a Wednesday in August at 11:47 a.m. 2 figures emerged from the tree line onto the south ridge, one in a Forest Service jacket, one in a photographer's vest. They stood at the ridge edge for approximately 14 minutes. During this time, the figure in the vest raised a camera, lowered it, was handed something. The figure in the Forest Service jacket raised the camera and appeared to photograph the other. Then the figures were close together. One raised a hand to the other's face. They remained close for a long time. The camera's motion sensor, which was calibrated for wildlife, flagged the footage as a non-wildlife event and would have deleted it after 72 hours on the standard rotation. A Forest Service technician reviewing the weekly footage saw it, paused it, watched it twice, and then, in a decision that was not in the protocol manual, but felt, to her, like the obviously correct one, saved it to a separate folder she labeled with no further annotation. Keep. The mountains were in the background of every frame. They did not move. They did not need to.